Hi, everyone, welcome back to this channel. We're currently hosting a marathon of questions focused on something you probably hate. Japanese counter words. There are more questions than usual this time. How are you all doing? Finding it tough? The early questions didn't involve any changes in reading the numbers, but in the later stages, there will be variations in how you read the beginning part combining the number and counter. I imagine that's where many of you will feel it gets hellish. Before diving into those questions, I want to take some time to point out something crucial that I really hope you'll all catch on to. Knowing this will make it much easier to tackle reading combinations of numbers and counters. So please bear with me until the end. If you feel like, it might help to pause the video at times, take notes, and verify your understanding as we go along. That could speed up your comprehension. Alright, now, let's get started. First of all, for those of you proficient in kanji, I have a recommendation. Forget the kanji numbers for now. Instead, relearn them using romaji, or the Romanized Japanese. One of the reasons you might get confused when counting numbers in Japanese is due to a commonality between your language and ours. That's right, it's kanji. For quick mastery, please do relearn them in romaji. Try writing out the counter words in romaji, too, and memorizing them that way. In Japanese, converting things to romaji can often make the logic clearer. For now though, let's focus specifically on counters related to counting quantities. First, the basics of counting numbers with counters in Japanese.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10
are how you read them. When simply counting with counters, you normally don't read 4 as
4
or
4 7
as
7
or
9
as
9
This is absolutely crucial to avoid confusion later on. You may encounter exceptions for specific items or written materials, but don't worry about those for now. Let me reiterate this important point. For 4, say
4
for 7, say
7
for 9, say
9 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10
When used with counters, you typically don't say
4 4 7
or
9
However, there is an important exceptional phrase involving 4, 7, and 9 that you absolutely must memorize. I'll cover that towards the end of this video, so be sure to pay attention to that part. Until then, let's stick to the standard readings when counting basic numbers with counters. Now, let's delve into how the pronunciation changes when numbers are accompanied by counting words, one number at a time. First, let's pay special attention to 1 or ichi. Ichi has various pronunciations, making it the trickiest one. It must be having a hard time. The basic pronunciation is the onyomi, ichi. Let's convert it to Roman letters. Ichi, ichi. Currently, in the romanization you're learning, chi is written as c, h, I. But in the past, it was closer to t, as in t, I. So, you could say that originally, it contained the checked tone, t. Please keep this point in mind first. It seems that many of this Japanese checked tones originated from the readings that came from China along with kanji characters in ancient times. When counting numbers using the reading method imported from China, most of it is referred to as Sino-Japanese numerals or Kango. Apart from counting numbers using the imported Chinese reading method, there's another reading method unique to Japan, called Wago. When it comes to the number 1, cases using
1
or just
1
will come up, but that's a different concept from the basics we're about to discuss, so let's not dwell on that for now. Remember the basics as ichi, ichi. Now, let's go through specific patterns. When the initial letter of the romanized counter word is K, S, T, C, H, and F, this is an irregular case for the ichi, reading. First, let's discuss counterwords that start with K, S, T, or C. As an initial preparation, when the counterword starts with K, S, T, or C, you need to double the initial letter by adding an identical letter in front of it. So it becomes KK, SS, TT, or CC. Then, you attach this doubled letter version of the counterword after the word ichi. However, you need to make a slight modification to ichi as well. Remember the checked tone we discussed earlier? You need to remove the portion after the checked tone consonant. With this, ichi's case, it exactly is the chi part, leaving only sound e or the alphabet I. Now, add the doubled letter version of the counter word after this.
I.
This becomes the correct way to count 1 plus that counter word. Let's look at an example. For 1 apple or 2 apples, etc. The counter word for apple is K, O, Ko, in Romaji. First, let's prepare the counter words part. Double the initial K of Ko, making it KKO. Next, prepare the number part. Remove the CHI from ichi, leaving just the alphabet I, which is pronounced just as
I.
Then, add KKO after I, making it I, K, K, and O. When pronounced, it sounds like this.
Ikko.
Yes, that's the correct answer. Does this make sense? Do you think you can apply this pattern? Let's try one more example. For 1 lion, or 2 lions, the counter word for lion is
To.
romanized as TOU. First, double the initial T of TOU by adding another T in front, so it becomes TTOU. Next, just like before, remove the checked tone consonant C, and everything after it from ichi, this leaves just I. Then, add the TTOU that we created earlier after this I, it becomes ITTOU. When pronounced, this is
Itto.
Are you getting a grasp of it now? There are a few more similar patterns coming up. Let's move forward. The remaining irregular elements are H and F. These are tricky. They require an additional step. When the initial letter of the romanized counterword is H or F, you replace it with PP. Let's look at an example. For 1 pen or 2 pens, and so on, the counterword for pen is HON.
Hon.
In Romaji, the initial letter is H. So replace this H with PP, making it PPON. For the ichi part, the process is the same as before with ko or to. Remove chi from ichi, leaving just I. Then, add PPON after it, making it IPPON.
Ippon.
Okay, let me give you another example with F. For 1 minute, 2 minutes, the counter word for minute is
Kun.
or FUN in Romaji. As you can see, the initial letter is F. Replace this with PP, making it PPUN. For the ichi part, the process is the same as before with ko or to. Remove chi from ichi, leaving just I. Then, add PPUN after it, making it IPPUN.
Ippun.
The major irregular cases for the on-readings that we've covered so far involve counterwords starting with K, S, T, C, H, or F. For counterwords that start with letters other than those, you can generally just use ichi plus the counterword. However, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the troublesome aspect of one or ichi is that there are cases where we use the traditional Japanese way of counting. For now, let's move on to profiles of the other numbers. To systematically delve into logic, let's start by explaining the numbers that exhibit relatively similar changes. These are 6, 8, 10. Although the direction of change is the same, the condition under which the change occurs, namely the initial letter of the romanized counterword, is slightly different. First, it would be better to briefly explain the commonality between roku, hachi, and ju. Just like with the number ichi, the base is the reading that came from China, which includes a checked tone. It's easier to understand when written in Roman letters. 6 is roku, 8 is hachi. The K and C correspond to the checked tone. So, why is ju grouped together with these numbers? At first glance, you may not see a character that corresponds to it, right? This is because the reading has changed over time. In the distant past, ju was pronounced jip, jip. When written in the kana of that time, it became jifu. In ancient Japanese it was pronounced closely to ju. Converting jifu to the modern kana usage, it becomes jiu. While written as jiu in kana, from the medieval period onward, when reading it aloud, it underwent a change and became pronounced as ju. With this background, it becomes clear that ju, like ichi, roku, and hachi, has a checked tone that originated from China long ago. As a vestige of inheriting that, this number is read as ju, but it is also read as
ji.
Currently, in elementary schools and such, when 10 precedes certain counter words, it is taught as the original form
ji,
rather than ju. On the screen you are currently viewing, the small t is represented as tt for ease of understanding. That's the history and background behind the number 10. Okay, now, to make the subsequent explanation easier, let's pre-process these three numbers, just like we did with ichi, so that they change correctly when combined with counter words. For each number, we'll drop the characters after the checked tone. For roku, which is roku, we'll drop the two characters after the checked tone, k, which are k and u. For hachi, which is hachi, we'll drop the three characters after the checked tone, c, which are c, h and I. For ju, depending on how you romanize it, if it's ju, you don't need to do anything. If it's juu, just drop the final u. Now, let's explain the patterns. First, let's start with hachi and ju, which have the same number of characters that trigger the change as ichi. The characters that trigger the change are the same 6 characters as with ichi, the initial letters of the romanized counter words k, s, t, c, h, f. So you don't need to relearn them. Let's actually apply the changes. First, for counter words beginning with k, s, t, c, when these letters appear first, you duplicate that initial letter and add it to the beginning. Adding one letter at a time, it becomes kk, s's, tt, cc, right? Then, you add that duplicated counter word after the part we kept from before, ha, from hachi, or ju, from ju or ju use ju. That becomes the correct way to count with hachi plus counter word, or ju plus counter word. Let me give an example for one book, 2 books. The counter word, satsu. Romanized, it's satsu, right? First, take the initial s and duplicate it at the start of the counter word. Ssatsu, right? Next, from the romanized hachi, hachi, drop the c, h, and I. For ju, if you were taught juu, drop the final u. If taught as ju, leave it as is. Then add the ssatsu you made earlier after that. It becomes hassatsu,
8冊
or jussatsu,
10冊
right? Again, reading that aloud, it's
8冊
for 8 books,
10冊
for 10 books. Does this make sense? Think you can do it? Let's move on further. For the remaining irregular elements, h and f. If the first letter of the romanized counter word is h or f, replace the h or f with pp. Let me give an example. What Japanese people sometimes count when they can't sleep: sheep. For 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep. The counter, hiki, romanized. It's hiki, with the first letter, h. We replace this h with pp. so it becomes PPIKI. For 8 and 10, we do the same processing as we did for the satsu example. Then add PPIKI after that, becoming HAPPIKI
8匹
or JUPPIKI.
10匹
Again, reading this aloud, it's
8匹
for 8 sheep,
10匹
for 10 sheep. Let me give an example for F as well. A common counter word starting with F that you may use is for minutes of time. For 1 minute, 2 minutes, romanized as FUN. The first letter is F. Replace this with PP, so it becomes PPUN. For Hachi and Ju themselves, do the same processing as the satsu example. Then add PPUN after, becoming HAPPUN
8分
and JUPPUN.
10分
Reading aloud, that's
8分
for 8 minutes,
10分
for 10 minutes. For counter words whose first romanized letter is not K, S, T, C, H, or F, basically you can just use Hachi or Ju plus the counter word. Let's move on to the patterns for Roku. Roku exhibits irregularities when the first letter of the romanized counter word is K, H, or F. If K comes first, duplicate that initial letter and add it to the beginning. Adding one letter at a time, it becomes KK, right? Then, after pre-processing the additional letter to the initial one counting word, it needs to be attached after Roku. However, some adjustments are required for Roku as well during this process. Can you remember what needs to be done? Drop the K and everything after it, which corresponds to the checked tone. You're just left with R and O, right? Then, after that RO, add the counter word you created by duplicating the first letter. That becomes the correct way to count with Roku plus counter word. Let me give an example. Again, for 1 apple, 2 apples, the counter, ko. Romanized it's KO. First, duplicate the initial K at the start of the counter, KKO. Next, since it's Roku, drop the KU part. You're just left with RO, right? Then, after that, RO, add the KKO you created earlier. It becomes
6個
Reading that aloud is
6個
for 6 apples. Does this make sense? For H and F, it follows a similar pattern to Ichi, Hachi and Ju. Replace H or F with PP when it's the first letter of the romanized counter word. For example, 1 pen, 2 pens, the counter,
本
romanized it's HON with the first letter H. Replace this with PP, so it becomes PPON. For the Roku part, do the same processing as the ko example. Drop the KU to leave just RO. Then add PPON after that, becoming
6本
Reading aloud, that's
6本
for 6 pens. Repetition of the example continues, but please bear with me a bit longer. Let me give an F example too. For 1 minute, 2 minutes, FUN. The first letter is F, replace this with PP, so it becomes PPUN. For Roku, do the same processing. Drop the KU to leave RO. Then add PPUN after that, becoming
6分 6分
for 6 minutes. For the other alphabets that triggered irregularities with Ichi, Hachi, Shu, when the first romanized letter of the counter word is S, T, or C, you can simply add that counter word to Roku, as is, like
6冊
for 6 books,
6頭
6 strong or large animals,
6着
for 6 outfits, and so on. Please repeat and memorize these patterns thoroughly. Alright, let's move on to number 3. Yes, let's write it in Romaji, the Roman alphabet. Basically, we write it as SAN, but before the letters B and P, we spell it SAM. However, keep in mind that some Japanese people, depending on the era they attended school, may not have been taught this rule, so don't be too harsh about it. The N and M in
3
are plosive sounds, and also nasal sounds. The initial consonant sound of the counter word that follows this N or M is often a voiced consonant sound. However, there are some irregular exceptions where the consonant does not become voiced, but you don't need to memorize those for now. When you encounter them later, you can simply remember them as exceptions. For now, let's master only the patterns where the consonant is definitely voiced. This occurs when the first letter of the counter word in Romaji is H or F. When it's H, you basically change the H to the B sound when pronouncing it. When it's F, change the F to a single P sound when pronouncing it. For example, yes, again. The word
本
for 1 or 2 pens, right? So, following the formula from before, we change the H in
本
to B, pronouncing it as
本
This rule only applies for the number 3. Let's add a
3
to this. Yes, it becomes
3本
Now, what about when it's F? In this case, you basically change the F to P. Unlike with 1, 6, 8, and 10, it does not become a double PP. It remains a single P. A typical example is, again, the word for minute,
分
FUN, in Romaji. Following the formula, we change the F to P, pronouncing it as
分
So 3 minutes in Japanese is
3分
However, Japanese is a living language. Lately, some people pronounce it as
3分
And you can even find people asking online, is it
3分
or
3分
Officially, F becomes P, but specifically for minute, pronouncing it as
分
is often not corrected. However, be careful when taking tests. Many exceptions for
3
arise from the fact, as mentioned earlier, that the initial consonant sound of a counter word that follows an inner M, a plosive nasal sound, often becomes a voiced consonant sound. If a K comes after an N, it becomes either the Romaji's K or G sound. And if an S follows an N, it can become either an S or Z sound. Since there are no formulas like the ones we've covered so far for these cases, it's best to treat them as exceptions that need to be memorized as you encounter them. As mentioned earlier, there are a few other exceptions to
3
but they are minimal, and even if you're unaware of them, it won't lead to any major mistakes. It's often considered acceptable either way among Japanese people. For example, both
3階
and
3階
are now okay for the third floor. However, in the case of
3階
meaning 3 times, it absolutely does not become a voiced consonant. It's
3階
this is an exception. Similarly, both
3軒
and
3軒
are now okay for 3 houses, but in cases like 3 cases
3軒
or 3 prefectures,
3軒
it absolutely must be.
3軒
This is another example of an exception. Additionally, there are a very small number of cases where, contrary to the rule of changing H to B as mentioned earlier, the H unexpectedly changes to P instead of B lately. Some people even leave it unchanged. For example, the word 3 boxes remains
3箱
without changing to B, while some people say
3箱
and others say
2箱
using Wago, the Japanese own traditional way of pronunciation. There are also those who simply read it as
3箱
without any changes. This could be one of the things that might confuse you. However, since these cases are very few, I believe that encountering them and remembering them as exceptions is the best approach. Next is number 4, or yan. With yan, you need to watch out for counter words that start with the letter F. When you encounter F, change it to P just like with
3
However, while not very common, there are some Japanese people who pronounce F without changing it to P, and most people don't really question this. For counter words that don't start with F, you can just pronounce them normally as yan, plus the counter word. Unlike with
3、
for the number yan, basically you can generally leave h, as is without modifying it. But on very rare occasions, like with the number
3、
there are instances where h changes to p. Since these are also infrequent cases, it's best to simply make a note of them as you encounter them. When it comes to yan, it has become quite ambiguous in modern times, but the rules I've mentioned still exist to some extent. Just to be safe, be careful about this when taking tests. I'm sure many of you are eager to ask about the exceptions where 4 is pronounced as she or yo. However, to avoid confusion, I'll explain those towards the end of this number explanation video. Finally, let's discuss 2, 5, 7, and 9. I mean, ni, go, nana, and q. Basically, when counting with Sino-Japanese or Kango counter words, you read the numbers as ni, go, nana, and q, respectively. As long as you use these readings, you can simply attach the counter words in their original form, and you won't make any mistakes. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? So far, we've discussed the numbers 1 through 10, but I also considered whether there are other numbers that undergo similar changes. And there are.
100、1000、
And
万。100、
follows the same pattern as roku, 6. Specifically, you need to watch out for k, h, and f. 4
1000、
and
万、
follow the same pattern as.
3、
So you need to be mindful of h and f. Additionally, like with
3、
due to them being special co-occurring consonants, other consonants may also become voiced sounds, but there are no set formulas for these cases. It's best to simply make a note of them as you encounter them. But it's worth remembering one of the most important exceptions for sen first, because this pattern is commonly used. When counting in sen, you don't add ichi at the beginning. After
3、
the pronunciation becomes voiced. It's the irregular of this sen part, but yan remains unchanged. Roku and hachi follows the regular pattern of change. It goes like this.
1000、2000、3000、4000、5000、6000、7000、8000、9000。
After
9000、
the next is
1万。
However, if you specifically want to refer to it as 10 plus 1000, you would pronounce it as
10,000。
following the regular pattern. And remember this. When counting in 10,000s, you do add ichi at the beginning like these.
1万。
As for rei or 0, there are no changes, so just like with 2, 5, 7, and 9, you can simply attach the counter word in its original form without making any mistakes. That covers counting with Sino-Japanese or Kango numbers and Sino-Japanese Kango counter words. We've learned a lot. Next, let's touch briefly on counting using native Japanese words Wago. Counting with Wago can also be challenging for Japanese learners. First, you may not even know whether the counter word before you is Wago or Sino-Japanese Kango. We Japanese learn to distinguish them around 3rd or 4th grade in elementary school, which is possible because we've built up some understanding of the characteristics of the words by then. So for learners, you'll have to memorize which is which as you encounter them. However, once you know if a counter word is Wago or Kango, you can generally determine whether to use the native Japanese numeral like
1つ、2つ。
or the Sino-Japanese numeral like ichi, ni. Mainly, native Japanese numerals go with Wago counter words, while Sino-Japanese numerals go with Kango counter words. There are exceptions, but you'll have to memorize those as you go. It's the same for Japanese people. Additionally, there are cases of using Sino-Japanese numerals with loanword counter words, like
1セット、2セット。
which means 1 set 2 sets. But in general, when counting with Wago counter words, the irregular Wago numeral readings are only used from ichi through yan or go. Even when using Wago counter words, from 6 and above, The readings typically combine the Sino-Japanese numeral readings with the Wago counter words. Since it can get quite complicated, it's probably best to start by just memorizing the most commonly used ones. The most useful ones are
1つ、2つ、3つ、4つ、5つ、6つ、7つ、8つ、9つ、等。
And what Japanese people have to relearn from their parents as children are the day readings up to the 10th day.
1日、2日、3日、4日、5日、6日、7日、8日、9日、10日。
These you just have to memorize. They're closer to being nouns than counter words, so it may help to approach memorizing them with a noun mindset. And since we're on the topic of dates, let's cover the exceptions for the readings of 4, 7, and 9 here as well. For months.
1月、2月、3月、4月、5月、6月、7月、8月、9月、10月、11月、12月。
Again, these are closer to being nouns than counter words, so a noun mindset may help memorization. Sticking with the Wago plus number readings, we also have the people counter.
1人、2人、3人、4人、5人、6人、7人、8人、9人、10人。
With the mixing of Wago and Kango numerals, it gets even more complex and might feel overwhelming. But as with irregular verbs when learning English, repetitive chanting may be the best approach to memorization. If you've studied English before, think back. With those irregular verbs, you had to commit them to memory through sheer repetition. It's similar here. Alright, that concludes our introduction to the basic counting methods and exceptions regarding classifier usage. It was a lengthy video, but you made it through. Fantastic job. Language learning is indeed a journey that demands dedication and patience. Your completion of this video is a testament to that patience, and it bodes well for your Japanese learning journey. Next time, we'll return to our usual problem-solving format. You can expect plenty of problems that will challenge your understanding of the logic presented in this session. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share. I look forward to seeing you again on this channel.